Thanks for rising up. I'm Don Ennis. It's November, time of remembering and rejoicing. It's West Hartford Democrats who are doing the rejoicing after a victorious election day. The new term marks the Democrats' 10th year in power and another term with two out gay women on the town council. One Democrat, one Republican, both prior guests of our show. Earlier this month, a new public sculpture was dedicated to the transgender community in New York City. Its huge white fiberglass wings invite you to stand between them and dream. My friend Sam Champion invited me to attend its unveiling and to speak. This is the work of his husband, artist Rubem Roberbe, and it's named Dandara, after a Brazilian trans woman murdered in 2017. A beautiful kickoff for the month of trans awareness and remembrance. I'm also delighted to share with you these scenes from the recent event at Central Connecticut State University, an inspiring gathering of more than 1,500 faithful dedicating themselves to ending racial injustice. It was the founding of the Greater Hartford Interfaith Action Alliance. I was there, along with 118 congregants from my temple. I'm proud to say Congregation Beth Israel made up the largest group in attendance. Also in that huge auditorium was my guest for this episode. Reverend Aaron Miller is the senior pastor of Metropolitan Community Church of Hartford, where he has presided for more than 8 years. He holds a master's degree from Yale Divinity School and is a lead of the MCC's Global Trans Ministries. He led a contingent at the inaugural National Trans March on Washington. Aaron, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here in our studio. What is a trans man, for those people who are watching who don't know what a trans woman and a trans man is?
A trans man is someone who has gender transitioned from female presenting biologically at birth to male.
And what was that like being at the National Trans March? I've seen pictures, I've seen videos, but what was it like being in the middle of all of that?
Oh, it was very exciting. Anything that's first and historic is always going to be more exciting. But there were thousands of people there, great speakers. There was a Torch Awards the night before where Angelica Ross received an award. And it was I think, a slice of Hollywood.
She's a star of Pose, of course,
Yes,
on FX.
absolutely.
I love that show. It presents a side of American life that many people have not learned about.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about what the Global Trans Ministries is. What does that mean?
Well, we are now involving all of our churches as we raise awareness and visibility for transgender folk and gender nonconforming people, non-binary.
And when you said that you led the global, there were other countries involved that you represented. Could you name some of those?
Yes, Italy, Scotland, UK, Germany, and also Uganda. And so what we did with the march, we expanded it to ask the world of MCC to support and even do an empowerment service for visibility the next day on Sunday.
Now, Uganda is a country where, isn't it against the law to be LGBT?
Well, it is. It's criminalized, punishable by death.
Wow. Your church has been around not just the 8 years that you've been senior pastor, but 46 years. You had a celebration that I was very lucky to be invited to, marking 46 years of ministry. Tell me a little bit about your church and what it is that you were celebrating.
Okay, well, the MCC denomination was started 51 years ago for the LGBTQ community because we were not welcome in churches. And so we're 5 years younger than the denomination itself, and we celebrated 46 years of this ministry specifically and especially to the LGBTQ community. The event itself was fabulous. I know you enjoyed yourself.
A dinner and dance and awards?
And there were 2 awards for unsung heroes, but we raised up the transgender lives because as we approach Transgender Day of Remembrance, it's a somber event as we remember those that have been killed. So this was an event to raise up and celebrate the life of and the lives of those who are transgender, nonconforming, non-binary. The event itself, and I want to say to you, although the event itself was very wonderful. And Ace and Diana, Ace Ricker and Diana Lombardi were raised up as our unsung heroes. There's something that happened during that night that I thought was particularly special, so I'd like to share that with you.
Tell me.
As we were leaving, I took a picture. We were taking pictures with everybody, right? And there was somebody who's a member of our church who's Hindu, and he was in full India dress.
I did meet
cultural
him.
dress, okay? And then there were two people from Thailand who were in their cultural dress as well. And so we took a picture together at the end of the evening. I asked the folks from Thailand if they typically dress like that. And the mother said, no, we don't dress like this usually. And I said, what, for a festive event like this maybe? And she said, actually, we don't do that either. The reason we dressed up tonight is we heard everybody it could come as who they are, and they would be celebrated. And at a time when we have such an adverse effect with, and the rhetoric and all for immigration, imagine everyone is welcome, no matter what their sexual orientation or gender identity is welcome there to present as exactly who they are and to be celebrated and welcomed and loved.
They should be free to be who they are, whether it's about gender or about orientation or about their national origin.
Exactly right. And that was a night for all, liberation, healing, and celebration.
That's amazing. I did hear you mention, and I was very glad to hear both Ace Ricker and Diana Lombardi talk about their work, and you introduced each of them. Tell us a little bit about each of those folks, because being unsung heroes means that maybe we don't really know enough about them. Why did you choose those folks, and what did they do?
Well, in almost all the press releases, you'll see Diana Lombardi.
Every time there's an event.
There's an event, okay, or a training, or a press release on some legislation that needs to be pushed forward. The laws that we have and we enjoy in this state are because Diana, in part, pushed them forward. She's been a leader and a champion of civil and human rights for LGBTQ, but especially transgender folk. And so we needed to honor her. She's not one that she stands in the spotlight to do these trainings, but she doesn't stand in the spotlight wanting any attention. So it was time to bring her out.
That's awesome. And I'm new to Ace. I saw him for the first time at a news conference by Ted Doolittle, the state healthcare advocate, talking about fighting the Trump administration and his changes to transgender healthcare. Tell us a little bit about Ace.
Well, Ace has been an advocate and an ally and an educator now for 15 years, which is half of his life, entire life. It started, his passion grew from a place where coming out to his family was particularly painful, but they were there at the event, and we applauded them because in 10 years, that's what love can do. It can help a family bring it back together. But that passion has fueled him to be a youth advocate. And he's done that. And he goes to Bunnell High School every year, and he speaks to the kids in the Unlearn event, and he makes sure that everyone knows they're not only not alone, but he has their back. So he's an advocate. He's the next generation, which is why I thought it was particularly important to have Diana, who's been doing this for years, and then to have Ace, the next generation. And he's actually bought his own bullhorn. Okay, and he was at the Trans March, and I know that bullhorn's going to get a lot of use.
I also saw that you had the dais decorated with signs that Ace himself had brought to the march to make sure that people saw that trans lives matter.
Yes. My favorite is Made in God's Image. And so those 4 signs are now historic because they were carried by us on the March on Washington.
Made in God's image is what my rabbi told me when I came out to him. First he said, don't get a big head, you're not the first one. But the second thing he said is, he says, just like everyone, you were made in God's image.
Yes.
And God is not a he or a she, God is God, and you should be who you are. And I love that idea. Ace was personal to me because I met his girlfriend, who was so funny, and I got to meet and hug his mom. I wanted to thank his mom because my mom didn't accept me for who I am, and I wanted her to know how important it is for a mom to accept their child, no matter what. And we both had a little tear in our eye after that.
At that table was Grandma Dorothy, too.
I saw.
Grandma.
Yeah.
Okay.
Different generation completely, for both of us.
Yes,
we're young.
Exactly.
But to show the acceptance throughout the generations is important. Tell me what you encounter in your weekly ministries at MCC of Hartford, Metropolitan Community Church of Hartford. What is it that people come to your church for? Because they may be finding that they see an LGBT pride flag outside a church, but it's not the same, is it?
No, and because we were started for the LGBTQ community, our flags are waving, but we started for us in this special ministry. So it's not a matter of looking around when you come in and seeing if there are people like you, or whether you'll be accepted, or whether they will marry you, or whether they will ordain you, or put you, or call you forward in leadership. They will, when you walk into our church, you can be all of who you are and celebrated for that. Not tolerated, celebrated. It's very different.
I wrote an essay once about how I quit my church before it left me. I found that it was no longer a welcoming place for me. Even though the pastor himself wanted to welcome me, I have just been so connected to our Jewish congregations since marrying a Jewish woman, raising Jewish children, that it took me a good number of years before I realized that converting was the right step for me, not changing churches. What do you tell people who have a crisis of faith? I think that it's a given that LGBTQ people are just as faithful in their own way as those who oppose our existence and our rights. It's just that we don't necessarily often talk about it.
The issue for me is it separates us from our faith and God by that kind of rhetoric. Saying that you're not welcome, saying that you're not welcome in a church, but saying that God doesn't love you or that you're not lovable is very damaging, and it separates you from yourself and one another and from God. And so the very strength that we need from our faith to go through this life is almost denied to us by the rhetoric that we hear and we see in the harm that's done through religious voices.
And they often quote scriptures. There's a lot of scripture quotations that are supposed to indicate that Jesus was against LGBT or did not support gay people. My understanding, and I've studied religion for a long time, is that Jesus didn't once mention gay people.
However, he did mention transgender people, okay, in Matthew 19:12. And so he said that there are eunuchs, which are the gender variant, okay, the transgender folk, our ancestors, that there are eunuchs that are born that way, there are eunuchs that are made that way by other people, and then there are eunuchs that make themselves that for the glory of God. And I'm in the third category because I transitioned as a calling to do this work.
Tell me a little bit about your journey. And I know it's much easier to talk about the scriptures and the Bible and the church, but when did you know, and how did you turn your life around so that you could be the person I'm meeting today?
Well, it was a long journey, as it has been a few years.
In tribute to Brent Tannehill, should we take a drink? Because okay. the drinking game is you say journey and you take a drink.
Well, it's time to rise up, Dawn.
He got the memo.
Okay. I've known I was different all my life. I was going to transition when I was 19, and I called Johns Hopkins Hospital from a payphone and said that I wanted a sex change operation, which is what it was called at that time. They honestly put a doctor on the phone that day, which is really amazing. But he said that it was going to take a lot of time and a lot of money, and I knew that wasn't possible for me in my teens. So I decided to live a gay life in the sense that I would have a community to belong to. And then I was doing fine. I was very successful in corporate life for decades. And then I pursued the ministry. I felt called to ministry. And it was during my ordination interview, that I realized during that week that God made it very clear to me. I could continue to live the dual life that I was doing, and it was really living a lie in some ways, but I could not do that and minister in God's name.
How old were you? You said 19 when you first decided to take action, but how old were you when you actually walked in and said, I need to change my life?
I was 56.
Wow.
So later in life, but it was a calling for me, so it wasn't really a choice. So I went home from my ordination interview week, having been approved, and decided or started the transition process. And I didn't even know what that was. And if you know, 11 years ago, there was nothing. Right. So there was no internet to give you the resources. There were no models other than Christine Jorgensen and a couple of people that were in the spotlight over the years.
You started before even Chaz Bono.
Yes, actually, I contacted him.
Did you?
Yes, I did, through Facebook, because there's a song that his father did, which is called Laugh at Me. And that song got me through very dark years. And I wanted to thank him on behalf, for his father's work that gave me the courage and the hope to go through. And he said that song meant a lot to him too.
Wow, isn't that amazing?
Isn't it?
I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him, but I was in the uncomfortable position when I worked at ABC of people, for whatever reason, asking me, well, what is this whole transgender thing, this Chaz Bono, what's he doing? And why did they pick me to answer these questions? I guess maybe I was being more visible than I thought I was in my old presentation, but I felt a calling too. I felt it was time. It was time for me to start making those changes. It was 2008 that I started seeking gender therapy, understanding who I was. And believe it or not, I started on testosterone. I took testosterone for 5 years because I wanted to prove that I was a man. And it didn't work, did it? It didn't work. Tell me about being a trans man in our society right now. How difficult is it compared to what you see me experience in other trans people? Is it harder or easier? Do you think being a trans man is different than being a trans woman?
I think women in general are more vulnerable. So you add transgender to the front of that, you add race to that as well,
Wow.
And now you've hit the trifecta. So trans women of color are the most vulnerable among us. And I think trans women are very brave, you included.
Well,
Okay.
I'm lucky to have white privilege, and I used to have male privilege that got me through a lot of tough times. But it's true, trans women of color, I think it's over 22 now that we've
Yes.
had in America, as far as we know, the reported number of murders. And then, of course, like I said, in Brazil, the murders there are off the charts. When you do your Transgender Day of Remembrance on November 20th, every year, and this year you have something different planned. I understand you'll be doing a public ceremony as well.
Well, the city is doing the public ceremony. It was started by some of the insurance companies in the Hartford area. And so now the city of Hartford is now involved in being part of that and planning it. And that's right before our event. But the event itself, and I wanted to just touch upon Brazil because there are different reporting, record-keeping actions throughout the world, and Brazil is particularly good about reporting its deaths. We are not, and other countries are not. So 22 is not accurate, and it's underreported in every country because people don't know that it's a hate crime or it's trans-related. Necessarily, they miss gender, they miss name, and so it's hard to track them. I want to offer some caution about that, about how the different countries have different murder rates, because I think because it's underreported, we clearly don't know. We just know that it's epidemic and it's horrific.
Even the American Medical Association agrees with you. They've called it an epidemic. What do we do to help people understand that living a trans life, living an authentic life, is not saying that God made a mistake. It is not trying to butcher our bodies. I've often been confronted with fundamentalists who say, your body's a temple and you should not be changing it. And my response to that, of course, is, hello, Botox, Viagra, cosmetic surgery, boob jobs. I had the opposite, but reduction. But I'm curious as to what you think about those kind of so-called Christian responses to our community.
Thank you for air quotes for so-called, because it isn't a Christian response. The two greatest commands for Christians is to love self as we love one another and to love God with all of who we are. And so anybody who comes against me and says that I'm somebody unloved or unlovable by God isn't following the command. And it's up to God to decide. But God loves and is delighted where I'm a reflection as I'm a reflection, right? Made in the image of God. We all are. And the changing, we all change every day. Isn't that glorious? And God is changing us and we're changing ourselves, and all of it's glorious. Why would we say and impugn this in particular? It speaks to an inability to accept the diversity, the beautiful diversity of God's creation.
And as a former Catholic, I can also quote the third greatest commandment, which was love your neighbor like yourself, as you'd want to be loved, right? One of the things that scared me and delighted me when I first started exploring my gender identity was the fact that it wasn't about the clothes. Now, we're both wearing purple, which is really nice. I'm glad we call it coordinated. But people think that being trans is, a man in a dress, a person who is presumed female at birth, growing a beard and getting a double mastectomy or top surgery, as we call it. But it's really not about the physical part. My friend Jenny Boylan came up with this. She said, being gay or any other LGBT type orientation is who you want to go to bed with. But being trans is who you want to go to bed as. It's really what's between your ears. And Chaz Bono said, sex is what's between your legs, gender is what's between your ears. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in terms of, aside from the physical manifestations, and by the way, I remember having a beard and I only liked it because I didn't have to shave every day. But what was it like for you to experience these physical changes, and how different is it from what's already going on up here?
I would say that it's the most freeing thing that I've ever done. Although when I approached it, I was riddled with fear, as many of us are, about the loss that it may mean with family and jobs and housing. But when I was congruent or whole, even holy, there's only, you have to be whole to be holy, because you're incongruent any other way. And so going into the world, it for me was as if, and a friend of mine said, every day I go into the world knowing I'm going to fail because I can't do woman. Okay? Yeah. It's a very interesting concept because most people walk out the door and they have reasonable expectation to succeed during the day. And we are compromised walking out because we're being somebody we're not and acting as if the way the world wants to see us. People
see us and judge us immediately. And they also, in my case, something I've been working on, they judge us just because of our voice. They may not actually be paying as much attention to what they see as what they hear. And sometimes I'll get surd before someone actually takes a look at me and says, oh, I didn't associate that voice with that of a woman. One of the things I'm sure that your ministry is very much aware of is that suicide is a big problem in our community. And even though the Transgender Day of Remembrance is about people who were murdered, I often think of those people we lose to suicide on that day as well. It's not designed for that, but it's undeniable. And I think what's lost in the conversation is we're not committing suicide at an alarming rate because we're crazy. It's because of the rejection. It's because we face so much interference with our just wanting to be. Can you talk a little bit about how you help those people who are troubled and think that maybe it's time to just give up?
Thank you for bringing up about the suicide rate because it's 41%. Attempted suicide rate, I tell people when I coach or train that if you add to it those who attempt and succeed or those that do succeed or think about it and don't attempt, you're in the 90 percentile. And that's an alarming rate. So most of us have considered it because the level of pain and rejection in this world, because you know that most of the value and richness of your life is tied to relationships and your ability to support yourself and the hope and dreams that you can have for yourself. When you don't have those things, it's a harder life to live. There was a 17-year-old at a rally right after they rolled back the guidelines for the Transgender Youth, right after this administration took office. And he said, I didn't ever believe that in my lifetime I would see the government against me. And that was a 17-year-old. So we're very well aware that there are people that are struggling through this world, and especially so, suicide is an option when the pain gets too great or the isolation's so profound. And that's something we struggle with quite often. So how I deal with that, I have a lot of people coming to me for pastoral care for suicide and despond and despair, but also to undo and heal the harm that's been done through the religious rhetoric. Okay, so a lot of that is religious harm, that we have to heal. But the suicide in particular is very difficult. But it's a matter of starting from the ground up or the inside out, saying, you are beloved. And that's what we say every Sunday at church, and every time I talk about it about love. All right, that's what this is about. And I tell people that if you're hearing a preacher or any religious leader who is not speaking from a place of love, get up and leave, because it's not of God. God is of love, and God is love. So I start there with you are lovable, and I do trainings and workshops around this, and you are loved. The fact that you don't feel that is because what you've heard, but I don't care if you've heard it 1,000,000 times, it's still untrue. It's still a lie. And so to start redeeming, and people come to my workshops over and over again just to be affirmed and reaffirmed on that alone.
You mentioned the youth. You mentioned that 17-year-old. Tell us a little bit about the LGBTQ youth, because I don't think people understand. How can these people understand their gender identity, their orientation at a young age? They should wait till they're older and they can decide later. What's your response to that?
So we all know and we all have a gender identity, but it becomes obvious when it's a disconnect for us. And we know that pretty early, sometimes as early as 3 and 4 years old. We may not have a name, we may not have understood what it is, but we know we're different than everyone else, and we know that something's wrong with us or something that's not quite right. And so I think as you develop, and I'm sure this may be true for you as well.
I was 4.
Okay, and I knew it too, but it didn't have a name.
No.
And it took many years, and in fact, there wasn't a name until I was in my teens when Christine Jorgensen came out. That's when I said, that's me, you know, and then it began to have some clarity to it. And then when you have clarity, you can understand what's going on for you, and you can seek to have some kind of relief, whether it's medical or emotional or spiritual.
But you do believe that it's best to believe the child. If the child is insistent, if they're not resisting the opportunity to express a different gender, we should encourage them.
We should love our children, okay? It's really very simple. And if the child is presenting this one day and that the next day, just love your child, right?
How simple and wonderful.
It really is simple, not easy.
No, hate is so
simple.
much harder, and wanting to control and wanting to change.
And there's a lot of damage done to children by not accepting who they are from a very young age, because the suicide rate rises exponentially for children that are rejected by their parents.
The Metropolitan Community Church of Hartford. Tell everyone where it is so they can find it, because I had trouble finding it that very first time.
Okay, and our directions are on our website at www.mcchartford.com. We are at 155 Willis Street in Hartford. It's behind in the parish house of the Episcopal Church, the Church of the Good Shepherd.
Great. We'll put all the links on Rise Up with Dawn, and thank you so much, Aaron.
It's been a pleasure.
Bless you.
Bless you as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Well, that's Rise Up for this month. I'm Dawn Ennis. I'll be back next month with another episode. Don't forget to rise up.